Madeline Porter, a successful but hardened corporate executive, is on a flight to Boston when her carefully controlled world collides with Ben Turner, a quiet soldier traveling to save his young daughter's life. What begins as a tense and bitter exchange leaves Madeline angry and dismissive, but one unexpected discovery shatters her assumptions and ignites a journey she never saw coming. Haunted by guilt from her past and faced with the raw, undeniable love of a father fighting for his child, Madeline is forced to confront the walls she spent years building around her heart. Through moments of unexpected kindness and challenges she never anticipated, she'll begin to question everything: her priorities, her choices, and her understanding of what it truly means to make a difference. Can compassion and hope transform even the most closed-off hearts? Can one small girl's courage inspire a second chance at redemption? The Houston airport terminal buzzed with noise and movement. People darted around, clutching their bags and boarding passes like lifelines. Flight announcements echoed overhead, but Madeline Porter barely noticed. She checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes, lips pressing into a thin line of irritation. Her flight to Boston, delayed now by 30 minutes, was eating away at her carefully scheduled day. Madeline always prided herself on control. Her life was a tight, well-oiled machine, and she made sure it stayed that way. Every decision had purpose. Every action delivered results. At 38, she was one of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' top senior executives, a woman who commanded attention in any boardroom she entered. Her sharp black suit and designer heels exuded authority, and her sleek, dark hair framed a face of quiet confidence. Few people dared challenge her. Waiting in the gate area, she tugged her designer handbag closer to her side. Her phone buzzed, and she skimmed through yet another email about the upcoming pharmaceutical conference. The conference in Boston would be important. She would stand before hundreds of doctors, presenting new drug innovations that could secure major sales for the company. This was what mattered. Career, success, results. Attention, passengers on Flight 418 to Boston. We will now begin boarding first class. Maddie rose quickly, her heels clicking as she moved toward the gate. She had spent enough time flying economy in her early career. Now, her hard work earned her priority boarding and peace of mind in first class, no jostling crowds or crying babies. As she settled into her window seat, she exhaled slowly, trying to push away the tension of the day. The seat next to her remained empty for now. She hoped it would stay that way. Her peace was short-lived. A man in military fatigues stopped at her row, glancing at his boarding pass. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, his voice calm. "I think I'm in 2B. Maddie looked up. Her gaze narrowed slightly as she took in the man, tall, lean, with broad shoulders that filled his uniform. His duffel bag looked worn, its seams stretched and frayed. His boots carried scuff marks, likely from hard use. The name on his chest read, Turner B. He looked younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with short brown hair and a sharp jawline. "Of course," she muttered, shifting slightly to let him in. She made no effort to hide her annoyance, clutching her handbag close as he stowed his bag overhead. Ben Turner sat down with a faint wince, his hand brushing over his left side before he settled in. Maddie noticed, but said nothing. She glanced at his uniform again, trying not to roll her eyes. Soldiers seemed to expect special treatment everywhere they went. The thank yous, the discounts, the hero worship, it had grown tiresome. Ben finally looked her way. "Sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am." Maddie offered a tight smile. "No problem." Her tone betrayed her feelings. The plane filled with the sounds of settling passengers. The flight attendant began her safety instructions, but Maddie barely listened. Instead, she opened her laptop and focused on the presentation she would give at the conference. A few minutes later, the plane lifted off, leaving the Houston skyline behind. Maddie let out a sigh of relief. Once they landed, she could bury herself in work and leave this flight and her irritation behind. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Ben pulling a small photograph from his pocket. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression softening. Maddie could not help herself. "What is that? Some kind of photo op?" Ben turned slightly, his brows furrowing. "No, ma'am. It's my daughter, Emily. She's 6. Maddie scoffed. Of course, the family man card, convenient. She did not know why the words spilled out. Maybe it was his calm demeanor that irritated her, the quiet steadiness that seemed to challenge her constant edge. Ben looked at her, his eyes steady but unreadable. "Actually," he said quietly, "I am heading to Boston for Emily's treatment. She has leukemia." His words hung in the air like a sudden weight. For a brief moment, Maddie faltered, unsure of what to say. She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut. Leukemia. It was a word she had heard often in her line of work, a cruel illness that no child should have to endure. "Well," Maddie said, recovering quickly, "I suppose the military's health care covers that, right?" There was no malice in Ben's expression, only quiet resolve. "Some treatments, yes," he replied. "But Emily needs an experimental option, the kind that insurance does not fully cover." Maddie turned back to her laptop. "Figures," she muttered, more to herself than to him. The rest of the flight passed in uncomfortable silence. Ben read quietly, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing the photograph in his pocket. Maddie worked diligently, typing emails and refining her presentation. But every so often, her gaze flickered to the soldier next to her. His calmness grated on her nerves. When the plane touched down in Boston, Maddie grabbed her things quickly, hoping to avoid further interaction. As she made her way off the plane, she heard Ben's voice behind her. "Yes, I just landed," he was saying over the phone. His voice was strained, filled with quiet urgency. "No, I know visiting hours are almost over. Please, just keep her comfortable until I get there." The words lingered in Maddie's mind as she moved through the bustling airport terminal. She shook her head. "Not my business," she whispered under her breath. She had more important things to focus on: her presentation, her career. As Maddie stepped into her waiting taxi, she pushed thoughts of the soldier and his sick daughter from her mind. That night, Maddie settled into her suite at the Four Seasons, exhausted but satisfied. The room was opulent, with plush carpets and expansive windows overlooking the Boston skyline. She ordered room service and opened her laptop once more, determined to run through her presentation one last time. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Maddie swiped at it absent-mindedly. It was a news update from a Boston local station. The headline caught her eye. "Local hero and decorated veteran fights for daughter's life." Curiosity pulled at her, and Maddie tapped the article. The photo at the top of the page made her freeze. It was Ben Turner, still in his uniform, sitting beside a frail little girl in a hospital bed. She looked about 6 years old, with pale skin and no hair, but her smile lit up the room. Maddie felt her heart sink. She read the article in full. Staff Sergeant Ben Turner, recipient of a Purple Heart for bravery during his deployment, had been injured in an IED blast 2 years earlier. Despite his lingering pain and PTSD, Ben worked tirelessly to support his daughter Emily, who had been diagnosed with acute leukemia 6 months ago. The article detailed his struggles to fund Emily's treatment, experimental therapy, not covered by his insurance. It mentioned his unit's efforts to raise money, but they still fell short of what Emily needed. Maddie's chest tightened. She remembered the photograph he had held on the plane. She remembered her cruel comments. She scrolled further down, and there it was, the same photograph, but now larger. Ben, holding Emily, smiling through his own pain. Suddenly, Maddie could not breathe. The article ended with Ben's simple quote, "I promised her mother I would protect her. I just need to give her a chance." The words cut through Maddie like a blade. She pushed the laptop away and stood abruptly, pacing the room. "What is wrong with me?" she whispered. The memory of her own sister, Maria, Flashed in her mind Maria, pleading for help. For support, Maddie had been too focused on her career to give. The guilt she had buried for years clawed its way to the surface. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Maddie had spent so long pretending she was untouchable that her success absolved her of her past mistakes. But here was a man, a father, fighting with everything he had for his child, and she had mocked him. For the first time in years, Madeline Porter cried. Madeline sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the photograph of Ben Turner and his daughter on her laptop screen. The little girl's frail body was swallowed by hospital blankets, tubes running from her arms, but her smile shone brighter than the sterile hospital room around her. Maddie's eyes flicked back to Ben. He sat at the edge of the hospital bed, one arm wrapped gently around his daughter. His face was lined with exhaustion, the kind that could not be hidden by a stoic expression. Yet his smile was there, too small, hopeful, and strong for his little girl's sake. The caption under the photograph read, "Staff Sergeant Ben Turner sits with his 6-year-old daughter Emily, who battles acute leukemia at Boston Children's Hospital." Maddie pressed the laptop shut and stood up quickly, rubbing her hands over her face. Her chest felt heavy, like something inside her had shifted out of place. The hotel room was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. She paced the room, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. "Why can't I stop thinking about this?" she thought angrily. The truth haunted her. Every cutting remark she had hurled at Ben during the flight now came back to her, sharper than before. The irritation in her voice, the judgment in her words. She could still see his face, calm and unflinching as he tucked the photograph away. "Why do I even care?" she whispered to herself. She gripped the edge of the desk, staring out the window at the glittering Boston skyline. Outside, the world carried on as usual. Inside, something was unraveling. Maddie had spent her entire adult life climbing the corporate ladder. She had worked tirelessly to earn the respect of her colleagues and cement her place at the top. She believed success was the only thing that mattered, tangible proof that she was in control of her life. But control had come at a cost. The memory of her sister, Maria, crept into her mind like a shadow. It had been years since she thought about that day, Maria calling her from the hospital, her voice weak and pleading. Maria had been sick for months, and the bills had piled up quickly. Maddie had brushed her off, too busy preparing for a big presentation that would secure her first promotion. "You're strong, Maria," she had said on the phone. "You'll figure it out. I'll send something when I can." But Maddie never did. Maria had died 6 months later. Maddie arrived at the funeral late, carrying a bouquet of flowers that felt meaningless. Her family's stares, grief-stricken and accusing, burned into her memory. It was easier to bury the guilt than to face it. So she did. Until now. Ben's face, Emily's smile. They tore open a part of Maddie she had locked away long ago. She slumped onto the edge of the bed and dropped her head into her hands, tears stinging her eyes. "What is wrong with me?" she muttered again. Her phone buzzed from the desk, startling her. She wiped her eyes quickly and walked over to see who it was. An email notification from Meridian Pharmaceuticals reminded her of tomorrow's conference schedule. "Focus, Madeline," she told herself firmly, but her mind refused to cooperate. Instead, her fingers hovered over her phone screen as an idea took root. Before she could think it through, she searched Emily Turner Boston Children's Hospital. A fundraising page appeared near the top of the results. "Help Emily Turner fight leukemia." Maddie clicked on it, her heartbeat quickening. The page showed Emily's story in detail, her diagnosis, her treatment so far, and the experimental therapy that could save her life. The page was filled with updates from Ben himself, small messages of gratitude to those who had donated. One update read, "Thank you for your support. Emily had a rough week, but her smile keeps me going. We're so close to reaching our goal for her next round of treatment. I won't stop fighting for her. She's my everything." Maddie swallowed hard, blinking back tears. The fundraiser's progress bar showed they were still thousands of dollars short of their goal. Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the comments. Strangers had left words of encouragement and small donations, $10 here, $50 there. Maddie stared at the donation button. It felt ridiculous, pointless. What could she do to make a difference? But something inside her whispered, do something. Her hands moved almost on their own. She clicked the button and entered an amount, $10,000. It was a drop in the bucket compared to what she had in savings, but it made her hesitate. She hovered over the confirmation button. The memory of Maria's voice echoed in her head. You'll figure it out. Maddie clicked the button. The confirmation message appeared on the screen. Thank you for your donation. Maddie exhaled shakily, her hands trembling. She stared at the screen for a long moment, unable to move. The guilt she carried felt momentarily lighter, though not gone. It was a small gesture, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and yet it felt like the first real thing she had done in years. The next morning, Maddie woke to sunlight streaming through the hotel windows. She sat up slowly, the events of the previous night rushing back to her. She had barely slept, but something about today felt different. She picked up her phone and opened the fundraising page again. The total had gone up slightly overnight. Her donation sat anonymously near the top. She clicked on the latest update from Ben. We are so close now. Thank you to whoever made such a generous donation last night. Your kindness has given us hope. Maddie's throat tightened. She set the phone down and stared at the wall. By late afternoon, Maddie sat in the conference hall, surrounded by doctors, researchers, and pharmaceutical executives. She was supposed to feel energized, but her mind wandered. The sterile suits and polite applause felt empty. Her phone buzzed during the break. Another update from Ben's page. Emily's numbers are not good today. The doctors are adjusting her treatment plan. I'm heading back to her now. Thank you all for your prayers. Maddie's stomach dropped. She glanced around the bustling conference room, feeling strangely disconnected. The conversations about profit margins and clinical trials buzzed in her ears, but all she could think about was a little girl in a hospital bed and a father who refused to give up. What am I even doing here? That evening, Maddie found herself standing outside Boston Children's Hospital. She had no plan, no excuse for being there. The building loomed over her, its bright lights spilling into the darkening streets. She hesitated, clutching her handbag tightly. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked inside. The lobby smelled faintly of antiseptic, and families sat quietly in waiting areas, their faces lined with worry. Maddie approached the front desk, her voice hesitant for the first time in years. Excuse me, I'm looking for Emily Turner's room. The nurse behind the desk smiled gently. Are you family? Maddie froze. No, she said finally. I wanted to help. The nurse studied her for a moment, then nodded. I understand. She's on the pediatric oncology floor, room 204. Maddie thanked her and turned toward the elevator. As the doors closed, her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what she would say. The hallway was quiet, save for the soft hum of machines behind closed doors. Maddie stopped outside room 204 and peered through the small window. Inside, Ben sat in the same position she had seen in the photograph, holding Emily's hand and reading softly from a book. Emily's head rested against the pillow, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. Maddie's heart ached. For the first time, she felt like an outsider looking in on something real, something that mattered. She turned to leave, tears stinging her eyes, but stopped when she heard Ben's voice. I promised you, kiddo, he whispered, his voice filled with quiet resolve. I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this, together. Maddie pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. She had no right to be here, yet in that moment she made a silent promise of her own. Madeline stood frozen outside room 204, her hand still resting against the cold doorframe. Inside, Ben Turner's soft voice carried on, the faint words of Beauty and the Beast drifting into the hallway. And though the Beast had feared he would never love or be loved, he began to hope that he, too, could find happiness. Maddie blinked hard, wiping her damp cheek with the edge of her sleeve. What was she doing here? She had no reason to be standing outside this room. She was a stranger worse, someone who had mocked this man only days earlier. Turning quickly, Maddie made her way back down the hallway, her heels tapping softly on the floor. The pediatric oncology ward felt quieter than the rest of the hospital, though the weight in the air was heavy. Doors were cracked open, revealing glimpses of other children, some playing, others sleeping, some hooked up to machines and monitors. Parents sat quietly at their sides, their expressions worn and tired. By the time Maddie reached the lobby, she felt like she could not breathe. She burst through the glass front doors and stepped into the evening air, inhaling deeply. Boston had turned cold, and the crisp wind bit at her skin. She welcomed it. Anything to clear her spinning thoughts. She hailed a taxi, sliding into the back seat. As the driver pulled away, Maddie stared blankly out the window, the hospital lights growing smaller behind her. Back at the Four Seasons, Maddie collapsed into the armchair by the window. She tossed her handbag onto the floor, kicking off her heels. She was exhausted, but it was not physical. Her mind felt tangled, her thoughts refusing to settle. The sight of Ben reading to Emily stuck with her, his voice steady, his presence constant. She had dismissed him on the plane, so quick to judge his quiet strength as some kind of performance. But now she knew better. That man was holding his world together with everything he had. And here she was, sitting alone in a room that cost more per night than some families spent on rent. She glanced around the marble floors, the expansive bed, the untouched conference materials sitting neatly on the desk. Her life was comfortable, controlled, but for the first time, it all felt hollow. Pulling out her laptop, Maddie opened the fundraising page again. The number had barely moved since yesterday, the progress bar still short of its goal. Maddie stared at it, her heart tightening. What am I supposed to do? The guilt gnawed at her. She thought of Maria again, her sister's face pale and tired, her voice cracking as she asked for help. Maddie had ignored her. She told herself Maria's problems were not hers to fix. She'll figure it out, Maddie had thought. Everyone does. But Maria had not. The thought clawed at her insides. Maddie shut the laptop and leaned back in the chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. She was a problem solver. She fixed things. But this was not a sales strategy or a business negotiation. It was something messier, something real. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. James Cooper. Maddie sighed before answering. Hey, James. Hey, Maddie. Just checking in. You missed a couple of sessions today. Everything okay? Her voice tightened instinctively. Yes, fine. I just had a... She hesitated. Something came up. James paused. Well, you never miss work. Is it about the conference? I can send over the final schedule. Maddie pinched the bridge of her nose. No, it's not the conference. I'll be there tomorrow. Good, James replied. Then his tone softened. You sure you're okay? You sound different. Maddie blinked. Different. She had not heard that word in a long time. I'm fine, James. Thanks for checking in. All right, see you tomorrow. She hung up, staring at her phone. Different. For most of her life, Maddie had fought to make sure no one ever saw her as anything but polished, successful, and focused. Different was not a word she welcomed, and yet here she was, unraveling in a way she did not understand. Her gaze drifted to her phone again. Without thinking, she opened a search for Boston Children's Hospital and scrolled through the website. Words like pediatric oncology, experimental therapies, and patient stories flashed across the screen. Finally, she clicked on the Donations and Giving tab. The next morning, Maddie arrived at the conference early. The hotel ballroom buzzed with activity as attendees milled around in tailored suits, sipping coffee and chatting in low voices. Maddie moved mechanically, shaking hands and answering polite questions about her presentation. "You look tired," one colleague observed as she passed Maddie at the refreshment table. Maddie forced a smile. "Late night working," she replied, brushing it off. By the time her presentation began, Maddie's words felt like an echo in her own ears. She clicked through the slides, sales data, drug projections, and future innovations. The room listened, nodding occasionally, but Maddie barely registered their reactions. When she finished, polite applause filled the room. Maddie gathered her notes, her hands trembling slightly. For years, this was the moment she lived for: the applause, the approval, the acknowledgement of her success. But now, it felt meaningless. She hurried out of the ballroom as soon as questions ended, avoiding anyone who might stop her. The walls felt like they were closing in. By mid-afternoon, Maddie found herself back at Boston Children's Hospital. She did not know why she came. She told herself it was just to see if the donation page had gained traction. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was guilt. But as she walked through the glass doors, she felt something else. A pull. At the front desk, the receptionist smiled warmly. "Back again?" Maddie froze. I was just—" Before she could finish, the receptionist nodded. "You're not the first to come here and get drawn in. Sometimes you just need to see the kids to remember what matters." Maddie opened her mouth to respond but said nothing. The receptionist's words lingered as Maddie made her way to the elevators, her steps slower this time. When she reached the pediatric oncology floor, she stopped near the nurses' station. A woman with kind eyes and a ponytail looked up. Her badge read, "Annie Foster." "Can I help you?" the nurse asked gently. Maddie hesitated. I saw Emily Turner's story online. I wanted to—" she faltered. "I wanted to help." Nurse Annie smiled softly. "Emily is a little fighter. Her dad is with her now. He never leaves her side." Maddie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "What is she like? What makes her happy?" Annie's face lit up. "Oh, she loves princesses, especially Belle from Beauty and the Beast. She says Belle reminds her of herself, brave, smart, and kind." Maddie's chest tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned to leave, but Annie's voice stopped her. "Thank you for caring," Annie said softly. "People like you make a bigger difference than you know." Maddie's steps slowed as she walked back to the elevator. "People like you." She almost laughed. If only Annie knew the kind of person Maddie had been. Cold, judging, blind. But something had shifted. That evening, Maddie sat cross-legged on the hotel room floor, her laptop open and phone in hand. She made call after call, first to the hospital's donations office, then to event planners she had worked with in the past. "James," she said firmly when he picked up, "remember when you said I sounded different? I need a favor. A big one." Her voice, once sharp with ambition, now carried something new. Determination, purpose. Madeline sat at the small desk in her hotel room, surrounded by open notebooks, scribbled notes, and a glowing laptop screen. A half-finished cup of coffee sat cold beside her. The once tidy executive was now disheveled, her blazer draped over the back of a chair, her hair pulled hastily into a ponytail. It was well past midnight, but sleep refused to come. Instead, her mind churned relentlessly. Maddie had spent hours researching, reading about experimental treatments, compassionate care programs, and the staggering costs that families like Ben's faced. The reality hit her hard. No child should have to fight this hard for a chance to live. No parent should be pushed to the edge, scrambling to pay for the care their child needed. She rested her chin on her hand, staring at the glowing screen. This is bigger than one donation, she thought. Bigger than one hospital. The memory of Nurse Annie's words lingered in her mind. People like you make a bigger difference than you know." Maddie wanted to scoff at the thought. If only Annie knew how little kindness Maddie had shown in her life. Her chest tightened as memories from her past surfaced. Memories she had spent years burying. Maria had been the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. Younger than Maddie by 5 years, she had been full of laughter and warmth. Maddie often resented her sister's softness, seeing it as a weakness while they were growing up. Maddie had always been the practical one, the one who worked late into the night while Maria stayed close to their mother, helping with dinner or running errands. After their father died, Maria became the heart of their small family, while Maddie pushed herself harder and harder to succeed. Then Maria got sick. At first, the signs were small fatigue, weight loss, frequent fevers. By the time the diagnosis came, it was too late. Maddie had been climbing the corporate ladder then, her days a blur of presentations, flights, and boardroom meetings. When Maria called her one evening, her voice shaking, Maddie barely listened. "Maddie, I need your help," Maria had said. "The bills. I can't keep up. And the doctors." Maddie had cut her off, her tone curt. "Maria, I'm in the middle of something. I'll call you back." She never did. Maddie was too busy preparing for her first major presentation as a senior associate, too busy proving herself to people who barely knew her name. She promised herself she would send money later, once things settled down. Maria died 6 months later. Maddie arrived late to the funeral, wearing an expensive black dress that did nothing to hide her guilt. She stood at the back of the small church, her mother sobbing softly in the front row. She remembered gripping the edge of the pew, staring at Maria's photograph and feeling nothing but shame. She told herself she had done what she needed to do. Maria had been weak. Maddie had been strong. That was how the world worked. But in truth, Maddie had abandoned her sister when Maria needed her most. Maddie snapped back to the present, her breath shaky. She rubbed her eyes, forcing the tears back. She had spent years burying those memories, pretending they did not haunt her. But now, seeing Ben and Emily feeling the weight of their fight, it was as though the walls she had built were crumbling. "You can't change the past," she told herself, "but you can do something now." She glanced at the stack of papers she had been compiling. Pages of research on pediatric cancer treatments and patient funding programs sat in front of her. Maddie had spent years building connections, planners, vendors, foundations, and donors. She had used those connections to close multi-million-dollar deals for Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Now, she could use them for something else. Maddie picked up her phone and dialed James Cooper. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. "Maddie, it's 2 a.m. "I know," she said quickly, pacing the room. "But I need your help." There was a long pause. "What's going on?" "I want to organize a fundraising event. A gala. Something big. Something magical. It's for a little girl named Emily Turner. She's 6. She has leukemia, and she needs experimental treatment." James sounded confused. Wait, you're organizing a gala? For someone you don't even know?" Maddie hesitated. "It's complicated." James sighed. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "Yes," Maddie replied firmly. "I'm going to pull every connection I have. I need a venue, donors, decorations, everything. I want it to feel like a dream for her. Can you help me?" James was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, "I'll start making calls in the morning." "Thank you," Maddie whispered, relief flooding her. "Don't thank me yet," James said dryly. "You just pulled me into something insane." Maddie hung up and collapsed into the chair, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The next morning, Maddie skipped the final sessions of the conference entirely. She set up camp in the hotel lobby, her phone glued to her ear as she made call after call. "Listen, Susan," she said to an event planner she had worked with before. "I need you to pull together something spectacular. Think enchanted ballroom, fairy lights, princess themes, everything a 6-year-old would love. Susan's voice was skeptical. "You're serious? This isn't your usual style, Maddie." "I'm serious," Maddie replied firmly. "I'll pay whatever it takes. Just make it happen." Next, she called a florist she had worked with during a corporate retreat. "I need an enchanted garden. Roses, vines, something magical. And I need it ready in a week." One by one, Maddie tapped into her network caterers, decorators, lighting specialists, and performers. Each call was met with surprise, but Maddie's determination pushed through. She was relentless, using the same intensity she once reserved for business deals to bring this dream to life. By the end of the day, she had secured the hospital ballroom as the venue. Local businesses agreed to donate services, and several vendors promised to provide what they could at cost. Maddie knew it was only the beginning, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. That evening, Maddie returned to Boston Children's Hospital. This time, she did not hesitate as she stepped off the elevator. She found Nurse Annie at the station again. "You're back," Annie said, smiling. "I thought we might see you again." "I want to speak with Ben Turner," Maddie said quietly. "If that's okay." Annie's smile softened. "Let me check if he's up for visitors." A few minutes later, Annie returned. "He's in the family room. It's just down the hall." Maddie's heart pounded as she walked toward the room. She pushed open the door to find Ben sitting on a small couch, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face when he saw her. "Ms. Porter," he said slowly, standing. "What are you doing here?" Maddie swallowed hard, her voice steady but soft. "I came to help." Ben frowned, clearly confused. "Help?" Maddie stepped forward. "I know I was awful to you on that plane. I judged you, and I said things I regret. But I read about Emily, and Her voice wavered. "I want to do something. I'm organizing a fundraising gala. For her." Ben stared at her, as though trying to understand. "Why would you do that?" Maddie took a deep breath, her gaze meeting his. "Because I can. And because I should have done something years ago for someone I loved." The room fell silent. Ben studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "All right." Maddie felt a rush of relief. "Thank you." Ben sat back down, rubbing a hand over his face. "She loves princesses, you know, especially Belle. She says Belle's brave." Maddie's lips curved into a small smile. "Then let's give her a night she'll never forget." For the first time, Ben's face softened. "You really mean it, don't you?" "Yes," Maddie replied firmly. "I do." As she left the hospital that night, Maddie felt something shift inside her. It was not just about helping Emily. It was about doing what she had failed to do for Maria. And this time, she would not let herself fail again. Maddie stood in the middle of the Boston Children's Hospital ballroom, the empty space echoing around her. The wide room was unremarkable now, plain walls, dull tiles, and fluorescent lights. But in her mind, she saw the transformation beginning to take shape. "It is going to take a miracle to make this magical," Susan, the event planner, said as she stood beside Maddie, jotting notes on a clipboard. Her tone was skeptical, but Maddie had expected that. "It will happen," Maddie replied firmly. "We are not just planning an event. We are giving a little girl and her family hope." Susan sighed, flipping through her notes. "I can make it magical, Maddie, but you know this is bigger than princess costumes and fairy lights. A gala like this needs sponsors, donors' money, a lot of it." Maddie turned to her, her face resolute. "Let me handle the money. You handle the magic." Susan gave her a small, wry smile. "You are a hard woman to say no to, you know that?" Maddie smirked faintly. "I have heard that before." But inside, her confidence felt shakier than she let on. She was not planning this for a corporation or a business win. This was personal. It was uncharted territory, and she knew the weight of it could crush her if she let herself falter. Back at her hotel suite, Maddie set up her laptop on the dining table, her phone already buzzing with messages. The place looked nothing like it had 2 days ago. Papers, sticky notes, and half-empty coffee cups cluttered the surface. Maddie did not care. She was on a mission. Her first call was to her company's charitable foundation. "Dr. Thompson," Maddie said firmly when the director answered, "I am organizing a charity gala for a little girl here in Boston. She needs experimental leukemia treatment, and we are short on funding. I want Meridian Pharmaceuticals to match donations raised at the event, dollar for dollar." There was a pause on the other end. "That is an ambitious request, Madeline. You are asking for a significant commitment." "I know." Maddie's voice did not waver. "But I have numbers ready. Your team can vet every detail. The hospital is reputable, the need is real, and frankly, this would align perfectly with the Foundation's mission." Dr. Thompson's tone softened. "You sound different, Madeline. This is not your usual kind of project." Maddie's throat tightened slightly. "Sometimes life gives you a reason to change your priorities." After a long pause, Dr. Thompson agreed to a formal proposal review. It was not a guaranteed yes, but it was a start. Maddie hung up and immediately called James, her most trusted connection in the corporate world. "James," she began when he picked up, "I need you to pull together a list of donors, businesses, and anyone else willing to support a charity event in Boston." "Are you always this bossy, or is this a new thing?" James teased. "Less talking, more action, James," Maddie shot back, though a small smile tugged at her lips. James chuckled. All right. I will make some calls." For the next 3 days, Maddie worked tirelessly, using every resource she had. She called local businesses, corporate executives, old colleagues, and anyone she thought might care. Some calls went well, restaurant owners offering to cater at cost, florists promising roses by the dozens. Others were harder. Maddie quickly realized that not everyone shared her urgency. "We will think about it and get back to you." Gala donations are hard to guarantee. "Why this little girl? There are so many cases like hers." The last comment stung more than Maddie expected. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed after one particularly grueling call, staring blankly at the floor. Why Emily? Maddie thought of Ben Turner's face, steady but lined with exhaustion. She thought of Nurse Annie, who spoke about Emily like she was everyone's child. And most of all, Maddie thought of Maria, her sister's voice, tired but hopeful, asking for help Maddie had never given. Because it matters. That is why. Maddie pulled herself upright and dialed another number. By the end of the week, the pieces had begun to fall into place. Susan sent over sketches of the ballroom design, a castle-like transformation with soft lighting, twinkling fairy lights, and table centerpieces resembling enchanted rose domes. Maddie's connections had come through, too. The catering was set. A well-known Boston florist agreed to create floral installations that would look like they belonged in a storybook. A local entertainment company volunteered Disney princess performers for the event. Belle would make a special appearance just for Emily. Maddie knew none of this would matter without donors, so she drafted personalized emails and calls, pushing hard for support. Each conversation felt like a small victory, one more sponsor, one more check, one more step toward hope. Late one evening, Maddie sat in the hospital cafeteria surrounded by her notes and spreadsheets. She had practically moved into the hospital over the past few days, bouncing between planning the event and checking on its progress with Susan and James. She sipped her lukewarm coffee when a familiar voice broke into her thoughts. "You again?" Maddie looked up to see Nurse Annie standing in front of her, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "You look like you need something better than that," Annie said, handing her the cup. Maddie blinked in surprise. "Thank you." Annie sat down across from her, studying Maddie with a thoughtful expression. "I heard about what you are doing, the gala, the fundraising. That is a lot of work for someone who barely knows this family. Maddie looked down at her notes, unsure what to say. Finally, she spoke softly. I guess I am trying to make up for something I cannot fix. Annie's eyes softened. You cannot change the past, Maddie, but what you are doing now, it matters. It is not just about the money. Families like Ben's, they need hope. You are giving them that. Maddie swallowed hard, her voice quiet. I do not want to let them down. You won't, Annie said firmly. And trust me, Emily is going to love every minute of what you are doing. Maddie offered a small, grateful smile. How is she doing? Annie's expression dimmed slightly. It has been a hard week. They adjusted her treatment again, but she is still smiling through it. That girl is made of something strong. Just like her father, Maddie murmured. Annie nodded. Yes, he is stronger than most of us will ever understand. Maddie leaned back in her chair, staring out the cafeteria window at the dark sky. She could hear Ben's voice in her mind from the family room. I promised her mother I would protect her. I just need to give her a chance. That is what this is about, Maddie said suddenly, almost to herself. Annie tilted her head in question. Giving her a chance, Maddie continued. That is all Ben wants. That are all Emily needs. Annie smiled faintly. Then let's give her that chance. As Maddie walked back toward the lobby that night, she passed room 204. The door was slightly ajar. Inside she could hear Ben's voice, reading softly to Emily again. Sue and Belle said, I will love you, no matter what. Maddie paused, her chest tightening. She thought of all the years she had spent chasing things that ultimately did not matter. Success, control, approval. Now, she was chasing something real, something that could change lives, even if just one at a time. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Susan. Ballroom setup begins tomorrow. It is coming together. Maddie exhaled deeply, determination hardening in her chest. We are going to pull this off, she thought. For Emily. For Ben. For all the children who need hope. And maybe, just maybe, for herself. The day began before dawn. Maddie stood in the middle of the hospital ballroom, surrounded by the hum of activity. A team of workers unloaded crates of decorations, wheeled in stacks of chairs, and began unrolling deep blue carpets across the plain hospital floor. At one end of the room, Susan barked directions to the lighting crew, her clipboard tucked under one arm. Maddie felt a rush of anxiety as she scanned the room. This has to be perfect, she said quietly to herself. The event was only a few days away, and every detail mattered. Susan approached, a strand of hair falling loose from her normally tidy bun. The chandelier crew is delayed by an hour, she announced, frustrated, and the floral delivery got pushed back to this afternoon. Maddie tensed. We need the lighting finished before the flowers arrive. I know, Maddie, but this isn't a boardroom meeting. Things don't always run on schedule. Maddie opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. Susan was right. This was not her typical environment, where she controlled every variable with precision. Here, she was relying on strangers, volunteers, and vendors who owed her nothing but their goodwill. Her grip on control was loosening, and yet, for the first time, Maddie was learning to accept it. Fine, Maddie said finally, exhaling through her nose. Let's focus on the tables and centerpiece prep for now. I'll follow up with the florists. Susan nodded and headed off, leaving Maddie alone in the swirl of chaos. By mid-afternoon, progress had been made. The ballroom no longer looked like a sterile hospital space. Fairy lights twinkled overhead like stars, trailing down to create a soft, magical glow. The walls were draped with rich, golden fabric that softened the harsh edges of the room, and large crystal chandeliers were finally being hoisted into place. But Maddie was not satisfied yet. She stood by the ballroom doors, watching the workers move with purpose, when a familiar voice broke into her thoughts. You really are turning this place into a castle. Maddie turned quickly to see Ben standing a few feet away, dressed in jeans and a simple flannel shirt. His shoulders still held the posture of a soldier, but his face looked more relaxed than it had on the plane. Ben, Maddie said, her voice softening, what are you doing here? I heard from Nurse Annie that you were working on something big, Ben replied. He glanced around the room, taking it all in. She didn't exaggerate. Maddie felt a flicker of uncertainty. It's still coming together, she said. It has to be special for Emily. Ben nodded slowly, his gaze resting on a half-finished centerpiece, a glass dome with a delicate rose inside. She's going to love this, he said quietly. It's like something out of a storybook. Maddie crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly unsure how to respond. She had avoided direct conversations with Ben up until now. The shame of how she had treated him on the plane still gnawed at her, but here he was, calm as ever. Is Emily doing okay today? Maddie asked hesitantly. Ben looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. She's tired, but she's hanging in there. The new treatment has been hard on her, but she keeps asking me about princesses and castles, so you're giving her something to look forward to. Maddie's throat tightened. That's all I want, to give her something happy to hold on to. Ben studied her carefully. You've put a lot into this, he said. Most people wouldn't. I owe it to her, Maddie replied softly. To you too. Ben raised an eyebrow. You don't owe us anything. Yes, I do, Maddie said quickly, surprising herself with the intensity of her words. I judged you. I said things that… She shook her head, forcing herself to meet his eyes. I was cruel to you on that plane, Ben. And I hate myself for it. Ben's expression softened. You don't need to explain. Yes, I do, Maddie insisted. I spent years closing myself off, convincing myself that people had to fend for themselves, that everyone gets what they deserve. I was wrong. I have been wrong for a long time. Ben was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. Sometimes people carry battles we don't see, Maddie. I know that better than most. What matters is what we do when we realize we've been wrong. Maddie blinked back sudden tears, his words cutting through her carefully built armor. She cleared her throat. Well, she said, forcing a small smile, at least I'm finally doing something right. Ben smiled faintly, a kind of quiet understanding passing between them. You're doing a lot more than you realize. Later that evening, as the workers packed up for the night, Maddie received a text from Nurse Annie. Emily had a rough day today. Ben is with her now, reading to her again. Maddie stared at the message, her heart aching. She thought about what Ben had said earlier, that Emily kept asking about princesses and castles. An idea struck her. Grabbing her coat, Maddie left the hospital ballroom and headed up to the pediatric floor. The hallway outside Emily's room was quiet. Through the small window in the door, Maddie saw Ben sitting beside Emily's bed, a storybook open in his lap. Emily looked impossibly small against the pillows, her little face pale, but she was listening intently as Ben read. Maddie knocked softly on the door. Ben looked up, surprised, but motioned for her to come in. Hi, Emily, Maddie said gently, stepping closer to the bed. Emily turned her head toward her, her eyes curious but tired. Hi, she whispered. Ben closed the book, watching the exchange. Maddie smiled softly. I heard you like princesses. Emily nodded faintly. Belle is my favorite. Well, Maddie said, crouching down so she was at eye level, I know a little secret. There's a castle being built just for you downstairs, and Belle herself is going to be there. Emily's eyes widened, a small spark of excitement breaking through her exhaustion. Really? Really? Maddie said, her heart catching in her throat. It's all for you, Emily, because you're the bravest princess of all. Emily smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. Ben glanced at Maddie, his expression a mix of gratitude and surprise. Thank you, Emily whispered. You're welcome, Maddie replied, her voice soft. Now, you need to get lots of rest so you'll have enough energy to see the castle. Promise me? Promise! Maddie stood and met Ben's gaze. I'll let you both get some sleep, she said. Ben walked her to the door, his voice low. You didn't have to do that. I know, Maddie replied simply, but I wanted to. Ben smiled faintly. You're giving her something to fight for, Maddie. You don't know what that means. Maddie nodded, her throat tight. She's giving me something too. As she stepped out into the hallway, Maddie realized how much truth there was in that statement. Emily's courage and Ben's love for his daughter had cracked something open inside her. For years, Maddie had built walls around her heart, protecting herself from guilt, loss, and connection. But now, those walls were breaking, and something new was taking their place. The next morning, Maddie returned to the ballroom to oversee the final touches. The castle was beginning to come alive, twinkling lights overhead, soft golden drapes on the walls, and the first floral arrangements filling the air with the faint scent of roses. Maddie stood in the middle of it all, taking in the sight. For the first time in years, she felt something she could not quite name: hope. The morning of the gala arrived in a whirlwind of final preparations. The hospital ballroom had transformed completely. No longer sterile and plain, it had become something magical, an enchanted castle brought to life. The twinkling lights overhead mimicked a starlit sky. Golden drapes shimmered along the walls, and delicate roses sat beneath glass domes on every table. A chandelier hung in the center of the room, casting soft beams of light that danced across the floor. Maddie stood just inside the ballroom doors, watching as staff added the last finishing touches. Susan approached her, clipboard in hand, looking unusually relaxed for someone who had worked around the clock to make this happen. You pulled it off, Susan said, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and pride. Maddie exhaled slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room. No, we pulled it off. It was true. Maddie could not have done this alone. Vendors had offered discounts. Volunteers had given their time. Local businesses had provided support when she least expected it. The pieces had come together like a miracle, driven by the quiet kindness of strangers. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from James. Donors confirmed. Expect a full house tonight. We're already close to hitting the fundraising goal. Maddie felt a swell of relief as she tucked her phone back into her pocket. The door to the ballroom opened again, and Nurse Annie stepped in, her face lighting up as she took in the transformation. This is incredible, she said softly, turning to Maddie. You've given them something so special. Is Emily ready? Maddie asked, suddenly nervous. Annie smiled warmly. She's been asking about it all morning. Ben is helping her get ready now. Maddie's heart gave a little leap. This is it, she thought. This is what all the work was for. That evening, families began arriving, their faces lighting up as they stepped into the transformed ballroom. Children from the pediatric ward dressed as little princes and princesses moved through the space, their laughter filling the air. Parents followed close behind, their expressions softening as they took in the sight. Maddie stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. She wore a simple midnight blue gown that fell gracefully to her ankles, a deliberate choice to keep the focus on the children. Her hair was swept back, and for the first time in a long while, Maddie felt no need to wear her usual mask of corporate perfection. James arrived just as the ballroom filled, dressed in a sharp suit. He approached Maddie with a knowing smirk. This is impressive, Maddie. I don't know how you pulled it off. Teamwork, Maddie replied with a faint smile. And a lot of favors. James handed her a small stack of papers. Here's the updated donor list. We're already over the original target, and the matching funds from your company's foundation are going to put us over the top. Maddie flipped through the list, her heart swelling as she saw the names people who had come together to make this night possible. Thank you, James, she said softly. Don't thank me yet. The star of the show hasn't arrived. As if on cue, the room quieted slightly as the doors opened again. Maddie turned just in time to see Ben enter, holding Emily's hand. For a moment, Maddie could not breathe. Emily wore a beautiful yellow gown, her very own Belle-inspired dress that billowed gently around her as she walked. Her frail frame was still evident, her skin pale, but her eyes sparkled brighter than any chandelier in the room. Her small face lit up in awe as she took in the sight before her, the castle-like decorations, the twinkling lights, and the princesses waiting at the far end of the room. She looks like a real princess, Maddie whispered to herself. Ben, dressed in a simple black suit, smiled gently as he guided Emily forward. Maddie stepped out to meet them, her heart pounding. "Hi, Emily," Maddie said softly, crouching down to meet her at eye level. "You look beautiful." Emily's smile widened. "It's like Belle's castle," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Maddie blinked back tears. "That's because you're our princess tonight. And Belle is waiting to meet you." Emily's eyes grew even wider as she looked around the room. "Really?" "Really." Ben's voice broke through quietly. "Thank you," he said, his tone steady but filled with emotion. Maddie met his gaze and nodded, unable to find the words to reply. The gala began, and it was everything Maddie had envisioned. Music floated through the room as children danced with princess performers. Belle herself spent extra time with Emily, reading stories and twirling her gently around on the dance floor. Parents chatted at the tables, their faces relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. Maddie stood near the back of the room, watching it all unfold. She had planned every detail, but nothing could have prepared her for the joy she felt seeing the children laugh and play. James approached her, a glass of sparkling water in hand. "You should be proud," he said quietly, handing her the glass. Maddie accepted it, her voice soft. "It's not about me." James tilted his head. "Isn't it, though? You made this happen, Maddie, and you gave those families something they'll never forget." She looked out at the room again, her gaze finding Emily as she danced with Belle. Ben stood nearby, watching his daughter with a smile that made Maddie's chest tighten. "Maybe I did something right," she thought. As the evening wound down, the final fundraising total was announced. The crowd erupted in applause as the number appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. Maddie stood frozen, her eyes widening. They had not just met the goal, they had exceeded it. With the matching donation from Meridian Pharmaceuticals Foundation, Emily's treatment was fully funded, and there would be enough left to support other children in similar situations. Ben approached Maddie as the applause died down, his expression unreadable. "You did this," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Maddie shook her head. "No, we did this. You, your unit, this community, everyone came together for Emily." Ben studied her for a long moment, then said, "You didn't have to do any of this." "Yes, I did," Maddie replied softly, "because I couldn't help my sister, and I needed to get this right." Ben's expression softened as understanding dawned. "Your sister?" Maddie nodded, her throat tightening. "I lost her. I wasn't there when she needed me most. I failed her, and I've carried that with me for years. But this," she gestured around the room, "this felt like a chance to do something that mattered." Ben placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady. "You didn't fail tonight, Maddie. You gave my daughter hope. You gave all these families hope." Tears stung Maddie's eyes, but this time she did not hide them. "Thank you, Ben," she whispered. As the night drew to a close, Maddie found herself seated near the dance floor, watching as Emily twirled one last time in her yellow dress. Ben sat beside her, his voice quiet. "She asked me earlier if fairy godmothers are real," he said, glancing at Maddie. "What did you tell her?" Ben smiled faintly. "I told her sometimes they show up when you least expect them." Maddie looked back at Emily, her chest full of something she could not quite name: gratitude, peace, and maybe, for the first time in years, joy. "Maybe they do," she said softly. As the final song played and families began to say their goodbyes, Maddie closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself take it all in. The weight she had carried for so long felt lighter. For once, she had let herself care, really care, and it had changed everything. When she opened her eyes again, Emily was running toward her, her yellow skirt fluttering as she moved. "Miss Maddie!" she called, throwing her arms around Maddie's neck. Maddie hugged her tightly, smiling through her tears. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily looked up at her, her eyes sparkling. "This was the best night ever." Maddie laughed softly. "You know what, Emily? I think it was." And for the first time in years, Maddie truly believed it. The morning after the gala, the hospital felt unusually still. The noise and laughter of the enchanted ballroom had been replaced with the quiet hum of machines and soft footsteps along the pediatric floor. Madeline stood outside room 204, holding a small paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the previous night played in her mind like a dream: the twinkling lights, Emily's radiant smile as she twirled in her yellow dress, and Ben's steady voice thanking her again and again. They had raised enough money not just for Emily's treatment, but for other families struggling with the same fight. For the first time in her life, Maddie felt like she had done something real, something that mattered. Still, something tugged at her heart as she stood outside the hospital room. The celebration was over, but the real battle was not. Emily still had months of treatment ahead of her. The reality of her fight was there, behind the door, just as heavy as ever. Taking a steadying breath, Maddie knocked lightly. "Come in," Ben's voice called. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room was softly lit, a faint beam of morning sun cutting through the half-closed blinds. Emily was asleep, her small frame curled beneath the hospital blankets. Her belle dress now hung neatly on the wall, and the worn stuffed unicorn Maddie had seen before was tucked beside her on the pillow. Ben sat in the corner of the room, looking drained but calm. His hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed how little he had slept. Even now, he wore that same quiet resolve, as if the weight of his daughter's battle was one he would gladly carry forever. "Morning," Maddie said softly. Ben looked up, surprised to see her. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You're back early." "I thought I'd stop by before I head back to Houston," Maddie explained, though her heart sank at the thought of leaving. "I wanted to check on you both." Ben nodded, glancing at his sleeping daughter. "She's doing okay. Tired from last night, but she kept talking about Belle and the castle until she fell asleep. You gave her something to hold on to, Maddie. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to," Maddie said quietly. I wanted to help." Ben studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've seen a lot of people come and go through this hospital," he said finally. "People who mean well, but they don't stick around. You're different. You stayed." Maddie shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "I guess I needed to be here as much as you did," she admitted. "Not for Emily, for me." Ben's brow furrowed, but his voice remained gentle. "Why?" Maddie hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. She had been carrying the words for so long, but saying them felt like stepping onto fragile ground. Finally, she spoke. "My sister Maria, she died years ago," Maddie began. Her voice was steady, though the weight of her words felt heavy. "She was sick. She called me one night asking for help with her medical bills. I told her I was busy. I never called back. I was too focused on my career, on proving myself to people who didn't really matter." Ben watched her, silent and patient, as though he understood that this was something Maddie needed to say. "She didn't make it," Maddie continued, her throat tightening. And I've carried that with me every day since. I told myself I did the right thing, that I was being strong. But the truth is, I let her down. I wasn't there when she needed me, and I can never get that back. The room was quiet, except for the faint beep of Emily's monitors. Maddie forced herself to meet Ben's gaze. When I saw you on that plane, She broke off, shaking her head. I judged you. I was angry, not at you, but at myself. You reminded me of everything I failed to do for Maria. I think that's why I reacted the way I did. Ben's eyes softened, and he set his coffee cup aside. You're being too hard on yourself. No, Maddie said firmly, though her voice trembled. I needed to be. That guilt pushed me to do something good, something real. And I needed to tell you that, because you deserve to know the truth. Ben was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. I'm sorry about your sister, Maddie. Maddie nodded faintly, blinking back the tears that burned behind her eyes. You know, Ben continued, I learned something in the army that stuck with me all these years. You can't change what's already happened, no matter how much you wish you could. But you can decide what you're going to do next. Sometimes, that's the only choice we have. Maddie swallowed hard, his words settling deep in her chest. That's what I'm trying to do, she said softly. Make the right choices, now. Ben smiled faintly. Well, I'd say you're doing a pretty good job so far. Maddie let out a small laugh, surprised at how much lighter she felt. One step at a time, I guess. Ben glanced at Emily, his expression softening. She's going to remember what you did for her, Maddie. Not just the gala, but everything. You gave her hope when she needed it most. Maddie looked at Emily's small, peaceful face. She gave me hope, too. A short while later, Maddie left the hospital, her heart feeling heavy and full all at once. She had said her goodbyes to Ben and promised to keep in touch. The flight back to Houston later that afternoon felt different from the one she had taken to Boston. She no longer felt like the same person who had sat in first class, dismissing a man with a photograph in his pocket. That woman had been angry, closed off, and so focused on proving herself that she had lost sight of what mattered most. But now, as Maddie watched the Boston skyline disappear through the airplane window, she felt something unfamiliar, forgiveness, not just for Ben or for Emily, but for herself. I can't change the past, she thought, but I can choose what I do next. For the first time in years, Maddie felt like she was on the right path. The following days in Houston were a blur of emails, phone calls, and follow-ups. Maddie worked with James and the hospital team to ensure every cent raised at the gala went to its intended purpose. But the changes in Maddie's life ran deeper than her professional actions. She felt different in ways she could not fully explain. She started answering calls from her mother again, asking about family updates and reminiscing about Maria. She made time for conversations she would have once brushed off. Her desk at Meridian Pharmaceuticals no longer felt like the center of her world. Her focus shifted away from profits and numbers and toward using her influence to help others. She submitted a proposal to expand the company's compassionate care program, using what she had learned from Emily's case. It was not an easy shift. Maddie was met with resistance from colleagues who had known her only as the relentless, numbers-driven executive. But Maddie no longer cared. She fought for what mattered, just as she had promised herself she would. A month after the gala, Maddie received an unexpected call from Ben. Emily's numbers are improving, he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet joy. The doctors say the treatment is working. Maddie sank into her office chair, tears filling her eyes. That's incredible news, Ben. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. None of this would have been possible without you. Maddie smiled through her tears, her voice soft. It was never just me. It was all of us. As she hung up the phone, Maddie leaned back in her chair and stared out the window. The Houston skyline stretched out before her, bright and full of life. Forgiveness, she thought, doesn't erase the past, but it helps us build a better future. And for the first time in years, Maddie knew she had finally forgiven herself. 3 months had passed since the gala, and spring had come to Houston. The warmth of the season seemed to breathe new life into everything, and yet Madeline Porter's days remained as full as ever. She sat at her desk in Meridian Pharmaceuticals' sleek headquarters, reviewing yet another report. Her office was bright and modern, with a polished wooden desk and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline. It was everything Maddie had once dreamed of: a corner office, a nameplate on the door, and the respect of an entire company. But something had shifted. Her desk now held more than contracts and sales figures. Files marked Compassionate Care Initiative sat in neat stacks alongside donation proposals and pediatric patient cases. Framed pictures of the gala decorated her shelves, a little reminder of how far she had come. The centerpiece was a photograph sent by Ben a week earlier. It showed Emily at home, wearing her belle dress and holding a stuffed unicorn, while her hair, soft and faint, had just started to grow back. Maddie looked at the photo now, a small smile pulling at her lips. Emily's smile was infectious, and her face glowed with hope. The caption Ben had scribbled on the back of the photo read, "To Miss Maddie, our real-life fairy godmother. Love, Emily." A soft knock at her office door pulled Maddie from her thoughts. She looked up to find James stepping inside, a file in hand. "You're smiling at work," he teased. "Who are you, and what have you done with Madeline Porter?" Maddie rolled her eyes, though her smile didn't fade. "What do you want, James?" "Two things." He handed her the file and leaned against the edge of her desk. "First, the board approved your Compassionate Care expansion plan. Your program is officially rolling out to partner hospitals next quarter." Maddie's chest swelled with relief. "Thank you, James, for backing me up on this." "Hey, don't thank me. I just told them what you've already proven, that this program isn't charity, it's purpose. You turned it into something they couldn't ignore." Maddie nodded, her fingers brushing over the cover of the file. It had been a battle, convincing the company's board to approve the initiative. Many of them had seen it as an expense, not an investment. But Maddie had fought harder than she ever had, knowing how much it mattered. "And second?" Maddie asked. James smirked and held up his phone. "There's someone here to see you in the lobby. Someone small, wearing pigtails and holding a stuffed unicorn." Maddie's heart skipped a beat. "Emily?" "Emily," James confirmed, his grin wide. "And her dad. I'll let them up." When the elevator doors opened, Maddie stood waiting, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wasn't sure what to expect, but when Emily stepped out, dressed in jeans, a bright yellow t-shirt that read, "Princess Warrior," and sneakers that lit up when she walked, Maddie felt her breath catch. Emily's face was full of color now, her cheeks round and rosy. Her hair had started to grow back into soft tufts of brown, and her smile was as radiant as ever. She clutched the stuffed unicorn tightly in one arm and waved with her free hand. "Miss Maddie!" she cried, running forward. Maddie knelt down just in time for Emily to throw her arms around her neck. The warmth of the little girl's hug flooded Maddie with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Hi, sweetheart," Maddie said softly, holding her close. "Look at you. You're stronger than ever." Emily pulled back, grinning. "Daddy says I'm doing great, and I get to come see your office." Ben stepped out of the elevator then, smiling as he carried a small backpack over one shoulder. He looked different now, more rested, more at ease in his jeans and button-down shirt. His sharp military edge had softened, though his steady presence was unchanged. "Good to see you, Maddie," Ben said, his voice warm. Maddie stood and smiled. "You too, Ben. How was the flight?" "Easier than the last one, I'll say that," Ben replied with a teasing grin. Emily bounced on her heels, looking around the office with wide eyes. Daddy says you're the boss here, she said, her voice filled with awe. Maddie chuckled. Something like that. But I think you're the real boss today. Emily beamed, clearly pleased by the compliment. Daddy said I'm starting a new job. That's right, Maddie said, reaching over to her desk and holding out a small nameplate. The gold letters shone brightly. Emily Turner, Chief Happiness Officer. Emily's eyes grew wide as she read it. That's my name, she said, her voice filled with wonder. It is, Maddie said with a smile. And this is your title. I need someone really important to make sure all the kids who need help get the same magic you had. Will you help me? Yes, Emily cried, clutching the nameplate to her chest. Ben's voice came from behind them, his tone thick with emotion. Thank you, Maddie, for all of this. Maddie turned to face him, her voice soft. You don't need to thank me, Ben. You gave me more than I could ever give you. Ben tilted his head, his eyes kind. Still, you changed our lives. Maddie's throat tightened as she looked at Emily, who had already made herself at home in Maddie's office chair, spinning it back and forth with a look of pure joy on her face. I think she changed mine too, Maddie said quietly. Later that afternoon, Maddie walked Ben and Emily back to the elevator. Emily chatted the entire way, recounting the details of her morning, how she sat at Maddie's desk, explored the office, and told everyone she was now the boss of Smiles. As the elevator doors opened, Emily turned and gave Maddie another big hug. Bye, Miss Maddie. Thank you for everything, and I'll see you at the next princess party. Maddie laughed softly, crouching down to meet her at eye level. You can count on it, sweetheart. You're my favorite princess after all. Emily grinned and bounced into the elevator. Ben turned to Maddie, his voice quiet. I meant what I said. What you've done, who you've become, it matters. And I'm grateful. Maddie nodded, emotions swelling in her chest. Take care of yourself, Ben, and take care of her. Always. As the elevator doors slid shut, Maddie stood in the hallway, her heart full. The woman who had once judged a man on a plane felt miles away, as if she belonged to another life. Maddie had spent years building walls to protect herself, but in breaking them down, she had found something far more valuable. That evening, Maddie sat in her office, staring at the photo of Emily on her desk. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. Hospital board approved the new program funding. We're going to help hundreds of kids. Maddie smiled, tears of quiet joy filling her eyes. She thought of Maria then, not with guilt, but with peace. I couldn't save you, Maria, she thought, but I promise I will keep fighting for others. As the sun set over the Houston skyline, Maddie leaned back in her chair, a sense of calm settling over her. For so long, she had believed that success meant proving herself to others. Now she knew the truth. Success was about leaving the world better than she found it, and she would keep going. Because kindness had changed her path, and she would never forget where it had led her. A year had passed since the gala that changed everything. The morning light streamed through the large glass windows of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' lobby, casting golden streaks across the marble floors. Employees hurried to and fro, briefcases in hand, and heads bent toward their phones. But Madeline Porter stood still near the entrance, waiting. The newly designed office lobby reflected the transformation Maddie had championed in the company's culture. Alongside the corporate awards and sleek modern decor, now hung framed photos of the children helped through the Compassionate Care program, a program Maddie had fought to expand. Smiling faces of kids holding stuffed animals, balloons, and handmade thank you notes decorated the space, giving it life and purpose. In the center of the display was a photo that Maddie cherished most. Emily Turner, in her belle dress from the gala, her hair grown back into soft, curly pigtails, beamed at the camera, her cheeks rosy with health. Maddie checked her watch for the 5th time, not because she was impatient, but because she could not wait to see her visitors. She smoothed her blazer, a deep blue one she had chosen for today, and adjusted the Welcome Chief Happiness Officer banner hanging near the reception desk. Finally, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Maddie's face broke into a wide smile. "Miss Maddie!" Emily's high-pitched voice rang out as she darted forward, her pigtails bouncing and her sneakers lighting up with every step. She was a whirlwind of energy, clutching her stuffed unicorn tightly in one hand. Behind her, Ben followed more slowly, a small smile on his face as he carried a box tucked under one arm. "Hi, sweetheart," Maddie said, crouching down to wrap Emily in a hug. The little girl squeezed her tightly, and Maddie marveled at the strength in her arms. "Look at you! You've grown so much!" Emily pulled back, her face glowing. "Daddy says I'm super strong now," Ben chuckled as he stopped a few steps away. "She's not wrong." Maddie straightened and smiled warmly at him. "It's good to see you, Ben. How was the flight?" "Smooth," he replied, his tone easy and light. Emily couldn't stop talking about how she's the boss today. Emily grinned proudly. "Because I'm the Chief Happiness Officer." "That's right," Maddie replied, ruffling Emily's hair lightly. "And I've got your desk all set up, ready for you." "Does it have my name on it?" Emily asked eagerly. Maddie held up a small gold-framed nameplate she had prepared for her honorary employee. It read, "Emily Turner, Chief Happiness Officer." Emily squealed with delight, hugging her unicorn tightly. As Maddie led them through the office, heads turned and smiles spread across faces as people spotted Emily. Over the past year, her story had become part of the company's journey, a symbol of what they were now working toward. Employees who once rolled their eyes at the idea of a compassionate care program now spoke of it with pride, knowing the difference it had made. Maddie guided Emily and Ben into her corner office, where a small desk sat tucked into the corner, complete with crayons, coloring books, and a tiny stuffed unicorn waiting in the chair. "Your official workstation," Maddie said, holding out a hand with mock seriousness. Emily gasped dramatically, as if she had walked into a castle throne room. "It's perfect!" she exclaimed, running over to sit in her chair. Ben laughed quietly, setting the box he carried on Maddie's desk. "I think she's ready to get to work." "Readier than half of my team," Maddie teased. Ben's smile lingered as he looked around Maddie's office. It had changed since his last visit. Among the clinical research reports and sleek corporate tools were photographs of kids whose lives had been touched by the compassionate care program, kids like Emily. "You've done a lot," Ben said quietly, his voice carrying a note of admiration. Maddie looked up from where Emily was scribbling in a coloring book, and her expression softened. "So have you." Ben shook his head. "You know, a year ago, I didn't think we had a chance. I thought I'd lose her." "But you didn't give up," Maddie replied softly. "You fought for her every single day." "And so did you." Maddie's chest tightened as she thought back to that day on the plane, the hardened woman who had dismissed Ben with every cruel word she could think of. That woman felt like a stranger now. Maddie no longer carried her anger like armor. She no longer needed it. "I think we both had to learn what it means to really fight for something," Maddie said. Ben nodded, his gaze steady. "You changed my daughter's life, Maddie. And mine." Maddie looked down for a moment, collecting herself before replying. "You and Emily changed mine too." Later that afternoon, Maddie took Ben and Emily to a meeting with Meridian Pharmaceuticals' senior leadership team. Emily sat at the head of the long conference table, her tiny legs dangling off the chair as executives smiled warmly in her direction. "I called this meeting," Maddie said, her voice carrying its familiar authority but softened with warmth, "because I want you all to meet the person who inspired everything we're doing here. Emily Turner is the reason the Compassionate Care Program exists today. She represents every child who needs us, who deserves the chance to get better, no matter how hard the fight." Emily grinned, clearly proud of herself, as Maddie continued. This program is about more than numbers. It's about kindness. It's about hope. And it's about ensuring that families like the Turners never have to fight alone. The room fell silent for a moment before the CEO, a distinguished man in his 60s, leaned forward and smiled. "Emily," he said kindly, "I think you've earned your title as Chief Happiness Officer." Emily's face lit up, and Maddie felt a swell of pride so deep it surprised her. That evening, after Ben and Emily had returned to their hotel, Maddie sat at her desk, staring at the quiet city below. The setting sun turned the skyline orange and gold, and the hum of traffic far below seemed distant and unimportant. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She clicked it open to find an update from the hospital's director. "The Compassionate Care Program has reached 100 families this quarter. Children are receiving treatments because of the funding you made possible. Thank you for being part of this change." Maddie leaned back in her chair, tears welling in her eyes. She looked again at the photo of Emily in her bell dress, smiling brightly at the camera. Her thoughts drifted to Maria, her sister's voice, the phone call Maddie had ignored, and the years she had spent punishing herself for it. For so long, Maddie had believed she could never make it right, but now she understood. She could not change the past, but she could honor Maria by fighting for others who needed someone to stand beside them. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo message from Ben. It showed Emily holding a homemade sign that read, "Thank you, Miss Maddie. I'm the happiest Chief Happiness Officer ever." Maddie laughed softly, wiping away tears as she typed her reply. "You're my favorite princess, Emily. Keep smiling. The best is yet to come." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, Maddie felt something she hadn't known in years: peace. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting it all sink in. This is what it means to live with purpose, she thought. Kindness had changed her. Forgiveness had healed her. And hope sparked by a little girl in a yellow dress had given her a new beginning. A soft breeze swept through the hospital garden as children played on the newly renovated playground. Laughter rang out, filling the air with a kind of music that soothed the soul. Emily Turner ran across the grass, her pigtails bouncing as she chased a bright blue ball, her unicorn tucked under her arm. Nearby, Ben sat on a bench, watching her with a quiet smile. Madeline stood a short distance away, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat as she took it all in. The Compassionate Care Program's plaque gleamed in the sunlight, a small testament to how far they had come. "She's so full of life," Maddie said softly, joining Ben on the bench. "She is," Ben replied, his voice steady. "She's a fighter." Maddie looked at him, her smile warm. "So are you." For a moment, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the children play. Maddie's heart felt full in a way she never could have imagined. It had taken loss, guilt, and hard choices to lead her here, but she knew now that the journey had been worth it. As Emily ran back toward them, her face glowing with joy, Maddie knelt to meet her. "Hey, Chief Happiness Officer," she teased. "What's the plan for today?" Emily giggled. "Spreading more smiles," Maddie laughed softly, her voice full of pride. "That's a perfect plan." Emily darted off again, her laughter filling the air as Maddie watched her, the sunlight catching in her hair. Turning back to Ben, Maddie spoke quietly. "It's funny how life works, isn't it? Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything." Ben nodded, looking at her with quiet understanding. "It really can. Thank you for joining us on this journey of kindness, hope, and second chances. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion can change someone's path forever. If this story touched your heart, remember to spread kindness wherever you can. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. Together, we can make a difference, one small act of kindness at a time.